Today, we are honored to welcome Sayre Posey, Utah's 2025 Teacher of the Year. Sayre is a nationally recognized educator and a fierce advocate for equity, belonging, and student voice in schools. Sayre teaches U.S. history at Northwest Middle School in Salt Lake City, one of Utah's most diverse schools, where every day is a masterclass in leadership, resilience, and critical thinking.
I kind of always talk about the power of strong instruction, strong community, and strong relationships. Those for me are the three big things that I emphasize when I'm talking about my classroom and how I see education.
What would you say to the federal government?
Don't get rid of the Department of Education.
And the vision is that it'll create an active democracy.
Gotta say, for a social studies teacher, we love the idea. We love that. We love talking about that.
Sayre students don't just memorize dates, they challenge narratives, explore identity, and ask the big questions. Who gets to write history? Who benefits? And what can we learn from the past to build a more just future? These are really important questions in our country today. Sayre's approach to education is more than content. It is about connection. Whether she's mentioning new teachers, advocating for representation in curriculum, or leading equity work across her district, Sayre's building learning spaces where students are seen, heard, and empowered. Sayre, welcome. We're so glad to have you here.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I really appreciate it. I was blushing as I heard that. And it's so awesome to be here on the show this summer.
Thank you, Sayre. Sayre, tell us a little bit about how you got into teaching. What inspired you to become a teacher?
When I was growing up, my whole family's teachers. I never wanted to be a teacher because I was like, oh, I want to venture out and do something different than my family. And when I went to college, it was my first semester of school. And I just really, really missed being in a classroom. And I remember when I would talk to people and try to get them to convince me to not be a teacher. And I had a conversation with, one of my roommates who was on my floor. And I remember talking to him and I was like, oh, well, I think I can do more than just be a teacher. And he turned around and looked at me and was like, that is so offensive. Do you understand what you just said? All the people who have helped you throughout your life, in education, and you think you can do more than that. And so that was the last conversation I had. And I switched my major to education pretty shortly after. But I have a very visual memory of that happening because I was looking at myself in a mirror when we were having that conversation in the hallway. And so that's always kind of stuck in the back of my mind. But yeah, my mom was a kindergarten teacher. My great-grandfather spent 35 years teaching in one-room schoolhouses in the coal country of West Virginia. So he had 9 children and 4 of them were teachers and so many of his grandchildren were teachers. So I was showing a picture of my great-grandfather outside of his classroom with his students in 1904 to my class this past year. And one of my students was like, wow, Ms. Posey, it's teaching's in your blood. And I was like, yeah, it kind of is. That's cool that you said that. So that's kind of how I got started. I taught in Baltimore City public schools first before I moved to Utah. And I was super excited to work in a really diverse school here in Utah, Northwest Middle School.
Awesome, Sayre. So your great-grandfather, 1904, that's more than 120 years ago.
Yeah, it is.
And what does your mom, I'm sure she interacted with him. What does your mom tell about, or what does your family tell about him?
He was very strict. He had really strong classroom management. They called him, so his name was John Linger, but they called him John the Rock Linger because he was just like stone cold, like a rock. He had a really challenging life. I mean, he was a farmer. He was like a subsistence farmer. He worked really hard to like, you know, raise his family and provide for his family. His first 5 years teaching, we have his like pay record. He didn't get paid at all, like worked for nothing. And then after that, I mean, it was pretty dismal looking at what a salary for teaching was like in like 1900. You know, I know that's adjusted to inflation, but I think he would earn like $150, $200 a year. So you're definitely in it not for the money. Like you're in it because you love the kids.
This whole thing about teachers not getting paid enough, it's gone too long in our country then.
Yeah.
Since at least 1904 and longer. We'll delve a little bit deeper into your views on what state and the higher ups should be doing later on, Sayre. Very interesting. And then your mom was a kindergarten teacher.
Yeah, she taught kindergarten for 13 years. She worked at a Title I school. Mom was very like creative and pretty ingenious when it came to teaching kindergarten. She gave the students so much independence. So like when they did stations, she never had like, oh, only 5 students can go to blocks and only 5 students can go to dress up. She let the students like choose whatever the station they wanted to go to. She sang, instead of playing music, she always sang her songs. She like taught herself guitar. She taught the students sign language, and she also worked at a really diverse school.
Awesome, Sayre. And Sayre, you said that you changed your major to education, but what was the major that you started out with?
I originally was a social work major. Yeah. But I was glad that I switched because I feel like teachers have so many different roles, right? We are social workers. Sometimes we're nurses. Sometimes we're counselors, you know, sometimes we're like older siblings to our students. So I'm glad that I have a job where I like serve many roles and like wear many hats.
And then, so you changed your major to education
Mhm.
and graduated, and then started teaching right away, in Baltimore.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, and how long did you teach there?
I taught in Baltimore for 3 years. So I taught ninth grade American government and US history. So the kids had to take a high school assessment in American government to graduate from high school. But they took it in the ninth grade. And every year that the kids in Baltimore City started doing better on the government HSA, they would like rewrite it. So it was pretty tough. I mean, it was challenging because a lot of students didn't have social studies in middle school. And so a lot of kids were coming in with like very little social studies knowledge. My last year teaching there, I think the district pass rate that year was like 35% on the government HSA, and my pass rate was 77%. And that's like the proudest thing that I ever have about school. Like, that I was able to get that many of my students to, you know, pass that test and check a box for high school graduation, because it can be hard. It can be really challenging to take multiple choice tests on a computer when you don't have access to computers. Like we had one laptop cart in the whole school. And the internet was often not working, and I would have to, you know, connect to the shopping center Wi-Fi across the street, which was kind of sad, you know, in a school. But yeah, it was a great start to my career. I definitely learned a lot about building relationships and like the importance of having like a well-rounded curriculum that included like lots of diverse perspectives. And I definitely think that teaching in Baltimore City set me up for, you know, it was challenging, but it was like my heart was in it. And I credit my lack of a work-life balance to teaching in Baltimore City and just like loving it so much.
So you seem to be really into that
Yeah.
when you were there.
Yeah.
And you had success early on. You were 2016 Maryland Teacher of Promise, right? And you spent only 3 years there, so you got early recognition. But how was your first year of teaching? Now, you grew up in a family of educators, and And then you'd given swim lessons. So growing up, you were into teaching. But how was year one? Did you feel that wow, it's very different than what I thought it would be, or did it come naturally to you?
I really struggled with lesson planning. That was like my number one struggle. I could not pick what I wanted to teach. A lot of times, social studies classes have no curriculum. They just have like a list of standards. And I had a really hard time pacing everything and figuring out, backwards planning, like having an assessment that in mind, and then trying to decide from there, like where I wanted my lessons to go. So I think that for me, that was like my biggest challenge my first year teaching, as well as setting up classroom routines that like made my students feel safe. Even things just as simple as like finding a pencil, like where do you keep pencils? Those are all routines that new teachers, I think sometimes it goes over their head that they need to include those routines in their classroom and in their procedures, because otherwise, kids won't know what to do when they come in. But it's cool because I'm still able to keep in contact with a lot of my students from that first year. They like found me on social media later. One of my students, she just graduated with her teaching degree. So she studied early childhood education, and she has been talking with me about what her first year teaching is going to look like, because she is now working at the elementary school that is across the street from the high school that I taught at, where I met her. We were having a conversation about, what does the first year look like? What supplies do you need? What procedures? And she told me, it just like warmed my heart when she said, she was like, you were so young, you were, 22, and we all knew that you were like, the age of our siblings when you were teaching us, she said. But she was like, you're the reason that I could see myself in the classroom, because I never saw somebody so young. Whereas I was like, oh my gosh, I can't let any of the kids know that I'm 22. They can't know that this is my first year teaching. But for that student, it was like really helpful for her, like envisioning herself in the classroom, which she will be in. So, yeah.
And say by year three, something remarkable had already happened. The pass rate, you mentioned it nearly doubled, right? From going from 35 or 40% to 77%.
Yeah.
How did that happen? And what did you do?
So my first year, the pass rate was 50. And then my second year was like 65. And then that next year, I really wanted to get 80, but I got 77. And something that, I realized was my students just needed regular practice taking this test. So we would go to the computer lab, and in that grading program that I had purchased, I was also able to put in like multiple choice practice tests, or like students could take assessments on it. I also got involved in our district's professional learning community. So I was able to spend a lot of time working with other teachers in the district who served at similar schools, like neighborhood schools within the city. We spend time working on, what instructional strategies are working for our students, so we can all help our students pass this exam so they don't have to take these makeup bridge packets. They basically had to do a packet for every, like, based on their score, up to 5 packets of like assignments to make up for not passing this test. So the stakes were very high. I also got involved in redesigning the entire like US history assessments. So me and a couple other teachers from the city worked on revising these assessments, so they looked pretty much exactly like the Maryland government high school assessment. So when they were able to do that, like, I feel like when I started working with other people and working together on these, assessment building and curriculum and strategies and talking through things, that coupled with like really just honing in on like multiple choice practice for my students and getting them ready to take a test. I really enjoyed that. Like I felt like I was really growing as an educator.
Very interesting, Sarah. So you're beginning to decode a lot of it, and you did it all in 3 years, and um, there seems to be work that people typically do over a decade or something. And you talked about work-life balance. Did you just immerse yourself and you were into it?
Yeah, I've always struggled with work-life balance. I think the more things that I do with my students at school, the longer hours I work. Um, I think it's really I can never just like make a curriculum and then not revise it. Like I am always constantly revising, but it also like as I spend more time in the classroom, I feel like I'm better able to, I can make this assignment better. I can make this project better. And sometimes I just have to stop and be like, what I have is good enough. Because if I burn myself out, then like who's gonna be there to teach, you know?
And you're so involved in your work, and that's a hallmark of people, uh, who truly succeed eventually. They just can't stop working, and they have all these ideas, and they have to limit themselves at times. So that makes complete sense to me. And then you moved to Salt Lake City, taught at the school, and then you moved to Northwest,
Uh-huh.
right? And um, did you start teaching middle school right away at Northwest?
Yeah, Northwest is seventh and eighth grade. So I hadn't taught middle school since I was student teaching. So I had gone from ninth to 11th and then to eighth. And that year that I started teaching at Northwest Middle School was the year we were like on Zoom. So it was totally different from like teaching 11th graders to then, I'm talking on Zoom to middle schoolers. It's the first time I've really interacted with middle schoolers. And teaching on Zoom was very challenging for everyone. I really saw the resilience of eighth graders that year. There were eighth graders on Zoom who had to message me and say, "Hey, Ms. Posey, I have to leave the Zoom because my parents aren't home and I need to go run to the elementary school to get lunch for my siblings." Or I had students who had their siblings, they were like babysitting them all day while their families were at, work, especially for families who are working multiple jobs. So it was challenging for kids because a lot of times they didn't get to be kids, like they normally do at school. But I love eighth grade. I think my like dream grades are eighth grade and ninth grade. There's just something so fun about that age group. Usually when I tell people that I teach middle school, they're like, "Oh my gosh, how do you do it?" Like everyone always responds that way. But I think what's awesome about middle school is kids, they still want to please, they still want to do, buy into what we're doing in class. But they also, they're kind of mini adults. They want to be treated like adults. They want to be, talked to like they are adults. I love eighth grade so much. And a lot of teachers at my school like also echo those similar thoughts with like that age, the seventh through ninth grade age group is just like so fun.
I say one of the things that we read multiple times in learning more about your background is you said belonging. You really focused on belonging. You say it's the center of your teaching. Please tell us a little bit more about that as a concept, and then how do you actually look at that day to day in the classroom?
Yeah, I think when students feel like they belong, that is what gets kids out of bed and, coming to school in the morning. Um, when I talk about like my teaching philosophy and like what I do in my classroom, like when I'm, presenting, I kind of always like talk about the power of strong instruction, strong community, and strong relationships. Those for me are like the three big things that I emphasize when I'm talking about, my classroom and how I see education. I focus my learning on like facilitating learning, my role as a teacher as a facilitator rather than me as like the giver of knowledge. So Paulo Freire, his book Pedagogy of the Oppressed he's a Brazilian educator. His book like changed my life when I read that in college. And I've always really emphasized group work because when students are involved in collaboration and working together in groups, right, that is where they feel like their self-efficacy is increasing because, one, kids have to learn how to work with each other because you have to work with other people in whatever job or capacity you're going to have. I think a lot of times kids will come to the end of the year and they don't know all the names of the people in the class that they've been, sitting with for 180 days. With Paulo Freire, he like despises the banking concept of education, right? Where teachers are the givers of the knowledge and they deposit this learning into students. And I don't see education like that at all. I see myself as a teacher who learns from my students, where my students become the teachers. And they can also like see themselves as teachers in their own communities or in their, families and their households, in more than just as teachers in my classroom.
Understood. Sayre, so your approach to belonging then is accounting for the students' diverse backgrounds and then building that into the curriculum, and then empowering them to have a say in how they want to do things, catering into their agency. Is that what you're trying to do? Are those the core concepts you use?
Yeah, I would say so. I think belonging is also like rooted in seeing, our class as like a family. A lot of times, the way the schedule works, like kids might only see, their friends in like one or two classes. And so they're having to get to know people in different classes that they might not, talk to normally. There was one time in one of my classes that I taught at the high school. I have never seen a group of kids who like do not speak to one another just mesh so well. We would do funny things like everybody wear ripped jeans on Thursday, or like and then we would like take pictures for it. Like all of my classes, that's the goal I, strive for. Because when students feel like they belong, when they have strong relationships with their teachers, when they have strong relationships with people in their class, right? That's where the magic takes place. That's where students feel like they want to come to school, right? Because there's so many things in our world that, make school not seem super fashionable or like super attractive, right? I can stay home and talk to my friends and like watch TikTok, right? It's hard to capture like students' attention, unless there's so much buy-in, and that buy-in does come from, student belonging.
Understood, Sayre. But say the challenge we have is the diversity in the classroom, right? I mean, we as a country are so diverse, and then Salt Lake City, wow, that's going to be one of the most diverse places, or the top, top amongst in our country even. How do you do that, given the diversity in the classroom?
Yeah, I think it's such a strength. Like I have a poster in my classroom where students have written hello in every language like they have spoken. And I've had this poster for the past like 3 years, I think. And at this point, there's like 15 different languages on it. And the majority of my students are multilingual, meaning they like speak English as well as their home language or their native language. It is challenging, but my mind is coming back to a story of one of my students who just came here from Afghanistan this past year. I told the class that he speaks Dari, which is a dialect of Farsi. And that weekend, one of my students went home and learned how to say things in Dari so she could talk to the student. And she doesn't speak Dari. Like, she's never heard of that language before. She just said, hello, how are you, to the student. And he was just like, he was so excited. And then when another student came from Afghanistan who also joined that class, he was fluent in both English and Dari. And he knew that she was talking in Dari to the first student, he was like, how do you know Dari? Like, who taught you Dari? I do a project called National History Day in my classroom. This year will be the 52nd year for National History Day, where students are able to pick any topic in history that they want to study. And we spend 15 weeks researching and creating citations for our sources, finding primary sources. And then they design an exhibit or film a documentary or create a website based on what they've learned. And then they take that project and go compete with it at different contests. One of my students did the Kosovo War in 1999 that I had never even heard of, and the genocide of Albanian people. And that's how she ended up moving to the United States. Well, she was recording a documentary for her project and brought in her grandfather to interview him in Albanian. And it was so powerful. Like, I didn't understand what he was saying, but I could understand the power of the words that he was using. My students thought it was so amazing that, she spoke Albanian. She was interviewing her grandfather in Albanian. And so I think diversity is such a strength. I think the more that I get to know my students and their cultures and their history and their backgrounds, the better a teacher I become.
Do you think, if they approach history in that manner, they're just not learning history, they try to be history, right?
Yeah.
Right? Explain that transition, what happens to people when they learn history in that manner?
When students are learning history in a way that, in a way that's not just from the learner's perspective, right? When they understand all perspectives and they understand the importance of all perspectives, right? That gives them more critical thinking skills for, being those engaged, active citizens in today's society as well as in the future. I want my students to understand, and I say this throughout the school year so many times, right? There is no one right answer when it comes to history. Your perspective and your analysis of the evidence, you interpret history based on your perspective and your analysis. And that is doing the work of historians. Is this video that I just watched on TV or on YouTube, is this what actually happened? Or are there multiple perspectives that I should then research in order to, gain a fuller, better understanding of this topic? And kids are really doing those things. I think when they're, I think I see every year more of my students being able to translate those skills into what is happening in either the news or in their own lives.
Perspectives are very important in your classroom, but then how do you choose, Sayre? How do you decide which voices and histories to center in your curriculum? Because you're also trying to balance the diversity of the class itself, right? How do you make those choices?
I definitely try and center the voices and perspectives of people of color within U.S. history. Sometimes what happens is kids only learn about the negative things that happened with indigenous people, for example, or they only learn about slavery in the context of African American history. The history of people of color in our country is so much more broad and multifaceted than just the historic and systemic injustices that have occurred. One of my favorite activities that we do every year is a tea party for the Mexican-American War. So after students get just basic background knowledge on the Mexican-American War, they each are a different person who was involved or affected by the Mexican-American War. They become that person that day. Some of them dress up. And then in that tea party, students are taking on that role and then having conversations with other people who were involved, right, to learn what different perspectives were. Because something like the Mexican-American War, right, there's the argument that, the war is going to expand slavery, which it would. And so there's abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and people like Henry David Thoreau who are going to have a very different perspective on this war than somebody in Congress or, President James K. Polk, right? Native Americans during that time period, some of them felt like we're not going to win either way between, the United States and Mexico, right? They're both going to impede on our access to our ancestral lands. By giving students access to all perspectives as much as possible, right? Instead of just talking about colonial America and the different regions. Well, what injustices in our country today are rooted in colonial history? Those are, conversations that when kids have them, right, like they're really doing the work of historians. And that just in general, like makes my students, better.
Is that the goal, to really get them to feel like that soldier who had a forced conscription laid
Yeah.
upon him, or that other side of the negotiation table who may not have been the winners ultimately?
Yeah, it gets them to think about history. I do a crime scene where for the Boston Massacre, where the kids have to examine the crime scene and then decide whether or not it was murder or the British soldiers were acting in self-defense. And then we do the trial. So I'll have one of my kids represent Captain Thomas Preston, who was in charge of the Massachusetts regiment that fired upon the crowd. And that was really fun because the students were like real people, right? They had to think, as you said, and act like that person might, even though all they have is, some very brief primary sources. There's no picture of Samuel Gray, who was one of the people who was murdered. But his friend dressed up in like a costume and like dyed his hair and like put on a show for the trial. Some kids really get into that stuff because they're able to do history rather than just reading about it.
So that truly feels like being history,
Yeah.
right? Living it in that time and age. Now, Sarah, you're a classically trained violinist,
Yes.
right? And so, I'm sure you've had to perform over the years. Is your push towards reenactment, driven from that?
Sometimes I think, maybe. I'm not sure. I was never in theater, but now that I'm not sure where it came from, I think I just really liked, playing pretend as we did when we were kids. Pretending I was like Ron Weasley in like the Harry Potter books or the shows that I kind of grew up watching, right? Liberty's Kids. That was my favorite show on PBS. And it was a cartoon show about the American Revolution. And there was a video game where you got to be one of those characters. I mean, when I say video game, I mean it was like a computer disc that you would put in the computer. And you could report and write newspapers on different battles in the American Revolution. And so I think that kind of got me into, really thinking about like, oh, like these are the things I love to do. This is what I want to do when I teach history.
Understood, Sarah. Sarah, one of the things that I read is that you say that equity is not just a goal. In fact, it's a design principle.
Right.
Please tell us more about that.
Yeah, I think when we design equitable classrooms, right, that sets up a foundation and a system for student success. When I think of equity, I think of access for my students. Obviously, Salt Lake is in a very outdoorsy area, right? We are 25 minutes from world-class rock climbing and mountain biking and skiing. But a lot of my students who have lived there their whole lives have never gone up the canyon. They've never gone skiing. They've never gone rock climbing. And it's because those sports are so expensive. It costs a pretty penny to, buy enough stuff to go rock climbing. And so I spent some time volunteering with the Nordic Alliance of Utah. They have a partnership with Northwest, and we have a closet full of cross-country skis at the school. And so there's a program that they do where we go up and cross-country ski in Park City with the students once a week. And the joy that my students experience, right, when they're skiing for the first time and they didn't fall going down the hill and they're building relationships with these community volunteers, that really inspired me to create a rock climbing club. So the rock climbing club that I started, I got a bunch of donations for like climbing shoes. I got a bunch of donations for, um, actually like an organization helped pay for like all the rentals and the harnesses. And we did a healing informed rock climbing program, and it was like my dream because, rock climbing is what brought me to Utah, but I have so many students who have never experienced rock climbing before. And so giving students that opportunity to kind of see themselves in spaces where they don't necessarily like feel like they belong, especially when it comes to like outdoor recreation, right? That's closing an equity gap, right? I see equity in so many things, right? It comes with curriculum. It means, giving students access to sports that they might not normally get into, right? Equity is ensuring that students are represented in their curriculum and that it's not just diverse narratives for the sake of it. It's, framing your curriculum around your students.
It's an important resource,
Oh, yeah.
because school programs will only be able to fund so much, and we live in an era where funding towards education seems to be not increasing for sure. Rather, it's going the other way. Sayre, we heard that you recently completed a master's degree. Tell us a little bit more about what you did and what your thesis was on.
Yeah, so my master's was on the impact of project-based learning on student attitudes and engagement in history class. So I did a study in my class where I had my students like take surveys over a period of time, comparing their engagement and their attitude in history class when we were doing just like regular like inquiry-based learning compared to when they were working on their history projects. I think the most important thing that I learned for myself as an educator when it came to my research was I noticed in my literature review, one of the things that kept coming up when it came to research about project-based learning was the importance of giving students access to a public product. So students being able to either present their research or display their project somewhere or take their project to a contest. And I think that is something again that like generates buy-in. So what I want to do this coming year, now that I've done that research, is really try and emphasize how many, I don't want to just have one public product, their National History Day project. I want to, design my lessons so I can have multiple public products for my students during the year. So that they are able to, show their learning to people who are outside of our classroom and our school community.
Awesome, Sayre. Let's talk a little bit about technology in more detail. It seems that that role of using technology in the classroom is increasing now over the years. Have you seen that in the last 10 years you've been teaching? And are you incorporating more of that?
Oh yeah. I was not comfortable with technology at all when I first started teaching. And that was because in Baltimore City, talking about systemic inequities, right? There was one laptop cart in the whole building. And most of the laptops had like splotches of like dead pixels on them. So students couldn't even see their like practice test, that they were trying to take in order to pass this test that was required of them to graduate. So I did not do anything with technology until I moved to Salt Lake. I never used technology in class. I decided that I wanted to get my education technology endorsement added to my license. So I took, I think it was 21 credits in different education technology classes and topics so that I kind of got a feel for, okay, what does mobile learning look like? What is digital storytelling? How can I, integrate technology into just like little bits other than just only playing Kahoot, right? What are other ways that I can kind of like gamify education? When it comes to things like AI, right? I think students sometimes don't see AI as a way of support. They just see it as a way of work completion. And it's in our district, students can't access any AI like at school. It's just blocked from everything. But what I did this past year was I showed students just using something simple that they can all access, like ChatGPT, how in doing their research, they could brainstorm, research questions. They could brainstorm facts about their topics. They could modify. I had a student who was reading documents on the Salem witch trials, which were written in the 1600s and very hard to read. And so I showed her how to, copy and paste the primary source and put it into ChatGPT to then modify and scaffold it or break it down for her to understand as an eighth grader. I try and like show my students how to use ChatGPT or like Gemini or Magic School and how not to use it. I think a lot of times my students are like, oh, like, isn't that cheating? And so we have a conversation of, what is the difference between plagiarism and using AI to like support your learning? I'm taking a class right now on like foundations of AI and education. And one of the activities that we just did was creating a chatbot to help our students. So instead of, how they talk about how like when you are able to teach something, that's how you know that, a student has like mastered a topic. So instead of a student teaching another student, have a student, have a conversation with a chatbot and teach them, and then have that chatbot ask the students like clarification questions to have an understanding of like what the student knows. So we do everything pretty much like handwriting, but when it comes to like project-based learning, that's where we dive in and like have students use technology.
Understood, Sayre. That makes a lot of sense. In terms of AI, and you mentioned that students ask you, isn't this cheating? So, middle schoolers do have a deeper sense of what is cheating, and they're confused, and there's a sense of ethics built into them very deeply, right? Or where does that sense come from, and what kind of questions do they ask you?
I remember I've only ever had like two kids use AI and then turn it in as their work. And they both ended up being just like really great learning experiences for the student. So the one student who he used like Snapchat AI to complete his assignment and then turned it in. And I was like, I know that this is Snapchat AI. So like, what did you need that you used the AI for? And he was like, well, I just didn't have enough time to do the assignment. I had like a soccer game. And I said, what is something you could have done instead? And the kid was like, oh, I guess I could have asked you if I could have an extension. And I said, absolutely. Like, my professors are flexible with me. My administrators are flexible with me. Of course, I'm going to be flexible with you. And so I think part of that understanding ethics comes from that, sort of like social emotional learning of like teaching students how to communicate what their needs are, and how to, trust the people in their lives, and feel like they can actually, ask questions as silly as, well, isn't that cheating? Because it gives them like a grasp on like things that are, they're going to ask themselves later on in life too. And even next year, when they have, a lot of assignments online moving on to high school.
I think it's preparing them for what's going to come more in high school, and that lack of time is only going to get worse as they move higher on in their student journey. So a lot of AI seems to be used in interpreting difficult things, because you talked about historical document analysis as being a good use case for AI. What are some of the other places where you think AI could be used in a history class, as an example?
Yeah, so one of my students or two of my students, they did a Zoom interview. They interviewed a hip hop artist for their project on the parental advisory label, talking about like music and music censorship and First Amendment rights. But they hadn't set up the option on Zoom where you can have a transcription of the recording. So they were able to get on Adobe podcasting. Adobe has fantastic resources for like student-centered technology that's very user-friendly. And they uploaded that Zoom recording and it gave them a transcription of the interview. So it made it really easy for them to then incorporate that interview into their research and choosing like a quote that they wanted to use from that interview in their board. It's kind of a cool time to be in, and I tell that to my students too. And again, like I just really try and emphasize to them that AI is there to like support learning, and to like integrate technology in what they're learning, not as a way of just like completing their work. There's only thinking AI can give you an assignment answer is just such like a it's such a small thing compared to what AI can do.
So they're then using AI for media analysis, document analysis, getting feedback to make their work better. Those seem
Better,
to be
yeah.
those seem to be use cases. And what are your concerns on AI as a history teacher?
AI can definitely hallucinate. Like it can, it's challenging because even times when I've used it to like generate like a topic list, AI can make things up and you have to cross-check and reference and corroborate, those historical thinking skills. I think sometimes it also takes away the human component, right? Like a student can turn in an AI generated assignment that then the teacher grades with AI or gives feedback with AI. And, that's not what we want to see in education, right? That takes the humanity out of, that's kind of like my concern sometimes. Like, to what extent is this going to take the humanity aspect out of teaching? And I don't think it will. That's my one fear. Like, is this going to take the human aspect out of, life, out of teaching, out of our jobs?
So I think there are two critical pieces you're worried about: critical thinking amongst your students, and also for the teachers, the ability to critically evaluate a student and critically find the deficiency or the connection to them, right? Because if it's a AI grading them, then you don't get to see what's happening with the student, right? We have talked a lot about the past and the present. Let's start to talk a little bit about the future. One question I have for you is, how have you seen students change when you first started teaching to where the kind of students that you see now? I'm just trying to project what's going to happen in another 10 years from here on. And what do you see? Where do you see those trends going?
Yeah, I think COVID has definitely had a huge impact on students. I think I'm part of it is maybe I'm more aware of it. But I think mental health and technology and social media are like the two big things that have really changed. I think students are more willing to talk about mental health and challenges that they might be having, which is, really great, in terms of, supporting students and making sure that I can be the best teacher as possible, to help my students as they grow through their challenges, right? Growing through what you go through. But I definitely see, I mean, 10 years ago, not all of my students had cell phones, right? And like Reels and these like video software apps like TikTok were not around. And so I think, students are also more willing to have conversations about their own screen time. Like students really desperately want a plan to stop looking at their phone for 7 or 8 hours a day because it is addicting. And that's, that was the strategy in making these products. Even with, the harm that is very clear that, screen time and social media has on teenagers. Kind of like what I talked about in the beginning, like I see them as like very resilient, especially after surviving this pandemic where they spent third grade not spending time with their classmates.
Understood. Sayre, one fundamental question I want to get your perspectives on is, why don't students learn so well with technology or on their phone or in their laptop or digitally?
Why don't they?
Yeah.
I've noticed that writing for most students is easier. They will still say that they would prefer to handwrite something than type it. I think it feels more intimate and personal than like typing. When I say they don't learn quite as well, I just mean in terms of like the quality of their work. What I notice, if I were to give a like carbon copy of an assignment on Canvas where they're doing it on the computer versus on paper, I will pretty much always get a better response from students on paper. And I think it's because, they don't have this entire computing processing device, distracting them. I really learned that during COVID. Like when my kids came back in person, they were like, can we stop doing things on the computer? Now, this was when we were still mostly on Zoom. So they were doing everything on Canvas, but I would have kids beg, just like, can I do this? Can I handwrite this and then take a picture of it? And I was like, go right ahead if that's what you want to do, if you think you will do better in that way.
Sayre, let's delve a little bit deeper into what you just said. So, what's that key skill or mindset that you want your students to learn through your lessons in history? I think you're using your lessons in history as a way to prepare them for the future. What is that one skill you want them to learn?
I want them to feel the power of their voice. I want my students to know that, they may be small, they may be, 14, they may have just moved to the United States from somewhere else in the world and they're brand new to Utah, but there is still power in their voice. I think that comes from, by the end of the year, like the passion that my students see in like when I teach, inspires them to be passionate in their own research. When kids can like pick what they want to learn, and that choice is what's giving students, more power in their voice because they're able to like individualize their learning. Because I think that is what's going to give us a more empowered, informed, and engaged citizenry, and like upholding those principles of democracy that we feel, especially coming into America's 250th anniversary, are the foundation of our country.
Sayre, your work has put you in the spotlight in many different ways. How has that, all the awards that you've got even early on in your career, you showed a promise, and now you've been 2025 Utah Teacher of the Year. Do you feel that your voice is heard more? How has that changed your perspective on things? Now you're not just a teacher, you're a leader, right?
Yeah.
Tell us more.
When I think of advocacy, right, I think of giving people on the outside a perspective, or like pushing for change on the outside of the classroom based on our lived experiences inside the classroom. I feel like I've been able to spend a lot more time advocating for my community and all the amazing things that are happening in the west side of Salt Lake, and in my Northwest community, whether that's talking about it on the public radio. I am super grateful that I've been asked to do several like keynote addresses. And so I share all these things that we've kind of talked about today, talking about relationships and what strong instruction looks like, and the power of giving students the ability to show their, do a public product. I also have, I've written some op-eds, which have been really fun. I was invited by the Salt Lake Tribune to write an op-ed for their like voices predictions for 2025. I talked about, the importance of ensuring that our classrooms look like our teachers look like our classrooms, right? Because in Utah, 91% of teachers are white, myself included, but only 69% of our students are white, right? And if we were to match our state population where 21% of our students are Hispanic, that means we would need 7,000 Hispanic teachers in the state when we only have 1,200. just wrote an op-ed, but I don't think it's going to get published because I wrote an op-ed about the funding within the federal government that was withheld, even though it was congressionally allocated, right? That's $7 billion. I wrote an op-ed about, when we think about federal funding, there's not necessarily we don't always see what those programs look like, but here's what those programs look like in Utah. But that funding was released this past week, thankfully. I'm glad the pressure was put on by advocates for education and legislators around the country. But I definitely want to continue using my teacher voice to advocate for issues that I see in my community, and ensuring that, all students feel safe and secure at school, and that we're ensuring that representation exists in our, teacher workforce, to represent the amazing, beautiful, diverse landscape of our Utah's classrooms. So I definitely think that writing op-eds is something that I want to continue doing because people do read them. You reach a wide audience when you're writing to a newspaper.
Absolutely, Sarah. Your voice is very important to you. You're a recognized leader, and this is your life's work, and you're very passionate. They say teaching is like a marathon, and
Yes.
you've run many of those marathons now. As we head towards the end of this interview, I'm going to ask you to share your perspectives, or if I were to give you a direct channel to various kinds of audiences, right? Imagine one of them to be donors or second new teachers or existing teachers, third districts, fourth the state, and fifth the federal government. We'll talk about what you want to say to them. Okay, what would you say to donors today?
I would say thank you for one. It's sad that in all the money that is available from like federal and state governments, it is still not nearly enough to cover all of the expenses that we have for our classroom and we have for teaching. I have spent so much money out of pocket, but it's because we love our job and it's because we know that, giving students access to the best materials is like essential for creating equity in education, and like leveling that playing field. The donations for my students to, use materials and these project boards and scrapbook paper and fun letters to create their national history projects, like gave them the opportunity to be ambassadors for their community and present their work. So creating opportunities for like donations, I mean, donors are so important and they really do create equity in education.
What would you say to new teachers, Sarah?
Um, to new teachers, I would say the first 3 years are the hardest, but to stick with it. I would say find a mentor who can really help and guide you, who you trust, who you see yourself learning from. I would say don't rely on teachers pay teachers and chat GPT to make lesson plans because they are not always the most rigorous. Um, and it is very, very easy to get stuck in that loop of, oh, like there's something better out there for me. I can create a better lesson. It's very hard to really conceptualize the impact that teachers make. Um, but I would encourage them to realize that, the kid in your classroom who might not speak in class or like doesn't really talk to you might still be impacted by the way that you teach them, years, 20 years down the line. So I would say, like really focus on, building relationships with your students and getting to know your students, because when you know your students and you know their families and you know their backgrounds and you know the things that they love and are passionate about, having those conversations about things that really sometimes aren't related to school, right? That's the foundation of like a strong classroom culture.
What would you say to school districts across the country, You seem to be pretty well supported by, it's not like a city, but what would you say to districts across the country?
I would, if school districts prioritized like teacher leadership and how like teachers can lead from the classroom, I think that would do wonders for education, right? I think sometimes, and it's not to say that the learning that occurs from, administrators giving professional development or coaches giving professional development, not that they're not useful, but I think when I think about, where have I grown? Who have I grown from when it comes to my learning? As a teacher, like I always learn best from teachers. And so giving teachers the opportunity to give professional development and organize conferences and be central to district decisions and leadership. Teacher voice and teacher leadership is so important, and it can still be done and it still needs to be prioritized.
What would you say to state governments across the country?
There's state governments that, really prioritize education and funding, and there's state governments that don't. I think sometimes the Utah State Legislature does not have its best interest for students. I would really encourage state governments to think twice about voucher programs that take money away from public schools. There's, investigative reporting that has occurred that shows that parents have been using money from this, school voucher program to take their kids on vacation or to pay for like surf lessons. Or they're still sending their students to public schools, but they're collecting this voucher money like they're homeschooling their children. Public schools need to be like fully funded before any conversation takes place about funding school voucher programs.
Understood, Sayre. And what would you say to the federal government?
To the federal government, I would don't get rid of the Department of Education because it's really crucial in protecting student civil rights.
Sayre, last question for you. Is there anything else you would like to say to our audience?
Yeah, I just want to thank you so much for, selecting me to be on this podcast. I think education is, crucial for a healthy democracy. And we're in quite a weird time right now in our country when it comes to support for public education and teachers. Whenever people ask me, well, like, what's it like being a teacher? There's always opportunities to volunteer or to substitute in classrooms. And I think if people were getting involved in schools and in school communities, education of students is not just, the job of teachers, right? It takes a village. It takes everyone in the community. So I really encourage people to, for those of you who are not in the classroom, go volunteer at a school and check out and see what's going on in classrooms, because I think oftentimes what is said is being, happening in schools is like not what is going on at all. So just like we don't want to, rely on our phones for, information, right? We don't want to rely on our phones for information about what's going on in public schools. Public education is so, so important. And I'm very grateful. Thank you to all the teachers out there, especially as school is gearing up. We're going back in just a few weeks.
Awesome. Sayre, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I personally really enjoyed speaking with you. Your energy is infectious. Thank you for all the work that you have done. Your work is very important, for our country, to Utah, your community, the state, and our country. Today, we are honored to welcome Sayre Posey, Utah's 2025 Teacher of the Year. Sayre, thank you so much.
Thank you.